Uh, Thank you very much. Really appreciate the Rising Tide Foundation giving me the platform to discuss some of these ideas. As Nick was saying, in the past, I've probably been doing most of my presentations on this platform on Africa. And it's my work on Africa that got me to make this extraordinary trip to China I was there from the, the night of September 8th to the night of September 17th. There's no possible way in this class, or I believe in any single class, to go through the history of China, the culture of China, and everything that's been done. I could not do service to that. Someone should, but I'm not prepared to do that now. But what I do want to do is discuss some of the key strategic issues facing China and the United States / the Western nations. And what I've gained from this 9-day visit, which was centered around a 3-day conference that I was invited to participate in. The formal name is called the Beijing Xiangshan, Xiangshan, Beijing Xiangshan Forum. And it goes on, going on every year, I guess for a dozen or more years. It's a high-level conference which brings together security and defense specialists from around the world, so that there were many people there from all over the world, including the United States, in military uniform. And then there were representatives of governments, and then there were, quote, unofficial representatives of governments. And the United States was represented by a delegation. I was really not part of that delegation. As usual, I come in as a unique, independent voice. But it was an issue. It's a worldwide event, and it attracts a particular type of people for discussion. It was co-sponsored by the China Association of Military Services and the China Institute for International Strategy. So these CIISS and the military unit called CAMS, and they build this conference. I was invited to be speaker one particular section of the conference. The conference had 4 plenary sessions with basically 24 speakers, 6 speakers at plenaries, which everybody attended. And then aside from that, there were about 30 sessions on discussion on various topics. And these sessions ran parallel. So if you attended one, you missed another. So the title of the conference was Promoting Peace Through a Shared Future. My presentation, which was on one workshop, was Peace Building and Prospects for China-Africa Cooperation. It may be the case when Matthew sends out the video, he'll include the 2 articles from the conference, which are on Substack and are also on my website, Lawrence Freeman, AfricanWorld.com. One is my presentation at the conference on Africa-China cooperation, and the other was an overview of the conference, which was much longer, more detailed, and was circulated and published by Xinhua News after I got back to the United States. So the conference was, to give you an idea of how seriously the Chinese take this conference, it was opened by their National Defense Minister, or Minister of National Defense, Deng Zhuang. And he gave a whole presentation that opened the plenary session. One particular part of it was multipolarity equity. And that was one of the themes of the conference, was dealing now with a new, irreversible, multipolar world. And this brought in other topics, which I'll get to. Now, The conference lasted about 2.5 days. I came in prior to the conference 3 days early and crammed in as much sightseeing as possible in Beijing. I was just nonstop from morning till night, visiting places. It's an extraordinary city. It's an extraordinary culture, extraordinary history, which I'll add a little bit to in this discussion. And it gave me an opportunity to learn about the people of China and the culture of China, in addition to the issues brought up in the conference. So if you take my visit of several days in Beijing, and then when the conference ended, I went 2 days into Shanghai. So I got to visit two cities, which have left a great impression on me. And the insights it gave me to China's history, China's culture, the Chinese people who I talked to as much as possible, together with the strategic issues discussed at the conference, have vastly improved my knowledge and understanding of China and the relations between China and the United States. So it's very interesting right now. It was a very interesting experience for me, and I consider it one of the great experiences of my adult life. I would say definitely you should put on your bucket list or not pass up on the opportunity to visit China, because everything you hear propaganda-wise from the West United States, it just ain't true. And you could find out for yourself very, very quickly. I think I've told people in the past discussions that if you go to Ethiopia, you want to make sure you visit Lalibela. So now I've given you two things on your bucket list to consider for some of us who are in their senior years, like I am. But it's coincidence, I suppose. The conference actually started on the 12th of September, and the FOCAC conference, Forum on China and Africa, ended on the 6th of September. I didn't attend that, but it was an interesting development. You go from China's relationship to Africa, which again, the West completely misunderstands intentionally or just out of plain stupidity or more diplomatic ignorance. I guess it's part of both in some cases. But as you know, and as Nick alluded to, I mean, China has a very special relationship to Africa. I mean, I know it well. And it's not this silly notion of colonialization. There's no colonialization by China in Africa. There are business transactions. There's no debt trap diplomacy. Doesn't exist. There's no project, no country, no asset in an African nation that has been seized because they didn't pay their debt payments. And the ratio of China unilateral debt to Africa is still an extreme minority compared to Western debt of bondholders, sovereign funds, and multi-bank institutions. There is a special place for Africa in China, and it goes through rocky periods. I think in the last year or two, investment in Africa went way down. Now it's started to go back up. Some people predicted, not I, that at the FOCAC conference, China would have a massive reduction and there'd be no expansion of investment in infrastructure. And of course, that turned out not to be true. And I think they allocated $51 billion for infrastructure development. But China wants to develop Africa. And as you may gain knowledge from this presentation, China is maybe the most appropriate nation in the world to develop Africa because of how they've handled their poverty. And the poverty in Africa, for those who don't follow it so closely, it's approximately 450 million people living on less than $2.15 a day. That's the largest amount of people living in poverty in the world. more than India, more than Southeast Asia, and now more than China. Now, and that poverty is growing. In other words, the number of people living on poverty in the 54, 55 African nations is growing. As a percentage of the population, it's probably declining, but the absolute number, so more people live in poverty every year in Africa, and that's the only place in the world where poverty is increasing. And as I say, I hope you gain from these remarks today, China is best equipped to deal with that. The United States has shown no desire, inclination, commitment, disposition to tackling poverty. They say they do, but they don't. And there's been no intervention by the United States to help African nations since the death of our last statesman, President John F. Kennedy. And when he died in 1963, the legacy of his work lived on. The conclusion of the Volta Dam project in Ghana with Kwame Nkrumah. He never lived to see it. And Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown shortly after it came into existence. But there's a plaque on the Volta Dam, which was also a smelting project for bauxite into aluminum, in honor of John F. Kennedy. Other interventions have been minimal, actually, except for George W. Bush, who's revered in Africa because of PEPFAR, because of his contribution to providing assistance to medical assistance to people on AIDS, which of course strikes Africa hard than any other continent in the world. So what I was able to gain as there wasn't much follow-up discussion at the conference from the FOCAC conference, except a continuation of China's outlook. And then, of course, we just saw the conclusion of the two-day conference in Russia for the new expanded BRICS, which we'll discuss. So that BRICS conference is occurring approximately 1 month after the Xiangshan conference. At the end, we will have some opportunity for question and answers. And if you'd like to, I have put together painfully a slide presentation to give you a little bit of a feel for China. It was all new to me. My wife has studied China quite a bit. I derelict in that area. Now, the issues that were brought up, or not simply brought up, but the overarching issues that were discussed at the Xiangshan conference was one, how the West sees China as a competitor or as an adversary. Two was the rules-based order in this new multipolar world. And three, the focus that the Chinese government has on security and development, that they're connected. And this, by the way, was clear in the plenary session. I mean, the plenary session, to show you how inclusive this conference was, much different than conferences in Washington, D.C., which I've been attending for 30 years. This was an inclusive conference, and a conference where issues were actually debated out in diplomatic terms, but there were disagreements, and the disagreements were allowed to continue. I made a little bit of a fuss at the very beginning of the conference, because when I arrived for the first opening discussion Thursday morning, I was mobbed by about 40 press from China. And immediately, China Daily put up a minute, it's on my website, in my article, they put up a minute clip of me criticizing the rules-based order, which got circulated pretty well. And then I was included in an article in China Daily as well. So that was right at the beginning of the conference, before I even entered the opening plenary. But in the plenary, you had a representative from Germany who defended the rules-based order openly. You had speakers from Iran, you had speakers from Russia, you had 5 defense ministers from Africa, which is interesting. You have representatives of the Red Cross, representatives of the UN, representatives of Pakistan, of many other Asian countries. And of course, the Chinese leadership was moderating. I got a chance to intervene in the plenary as well. And I guess there was maybe 700 to 800 people totally there. It was so crowded that it was hard to get a seat at some point. I had to use my connections to make sure I was able to see the conference. And as I say, one of the most interesting and debated issues, which occupied at least 3 different sessions, was China-US-Africa relations. And the 2 main speakers were a fellow by the name of Richard Walters, who is now not part of the US government, but he just recently was the State Department expert on China and Taiwan and the Asia Pacific. He's quite knowledgeable and spoke a little bit of Chinese, and he was a very moderate presenter of the Western policy. And it was criticized by Professor Jianbao Wu, who was able to poke some very significant holes in Walter's argument. There were former members of the Defense Department were there. As I said, you had military Americans in military uniform, people from think tanks, Rand Corporation, all kinds of Americans were present. And I would say from the Africa side, outside of defense ministers who spoke, I think I met 2 Africans who came from the continent, one from Tanzania, not far from where Nick's abode is, and the other from Ghana. But there were 5 defense ministers who did present some aspect of what the policy they would like to see in terms of economic development. Now, the issue that, as I said, occupied 3 standing room only sessions is this question of the United States' relationship to China, which is very similar, not exactly the same as the United States' relationship to the BRICS nations, which is, Biden will say, and Blinken will say, and this guy, Rick Walters, unofficially representing the United States, will say, we really see China as a competitor, and that's how we should treat them. Now, this is a total lie, and Professor Wu continually poked holes in it, because in fact, if you read the think tank papers from both the Republican and Democrat Party, they do not see China as a competitor. They see China as an adversary that must be contained, must be repressed, must be controlled, and must be weakened. Because according to the idiotic, dangerous doctrine of the rules-based order and the zero-sum game, is you're either on top or you're on the bottom. It's zero-sum. Either you got 51 and the other guy's got 49, or the other way around. Or in the crudest terms, but makes the point, either you got your foot on their throat or they have their foot on your throat. That's the mentality of the West. I see no evidence in my time during the conference and meeting the Chinese people that there is any support for that argument. China wants to develop China. It wants to become a modern country. In fact, their goal is by 2035, become a modern socialized country, and then maybe an advanced country by 2049, which would be a 100-year anniversary of the founding of China. So their concern is China, China's development, and China's role in the world is based on development, as is the BRICS based on development. But the West cannot uncomprehend this. And although some of the people attending the conference, as I say, were not hardcore, but and Walters tried to present the best possible face, but as Professor Wu said, and I think they faced off against each other maybe 3 times, he said, well, then if you see us as a competitor, then you should walk the walk. And we're tired of talk the talk. Because publicly they'll say, oh, all we want is competition. But privately, and in the various more honest presentations by the Washington, D.C. intelligence community, they see him as an adversary, an enemy that maybe will not be militarily defeated, but an enemy that will be kept down and contained. And that theme went back and forth throughout the whole 2.5 days or so of the conference. The other issue, of course, I think I've spoken before on this platform, of course, is the question of the rules-based order. The West now knows that it's impossible that this will be reversed. The world is multipolar, and there are different views of that multipolarity. And the West now has to accept it. It can't be reversed. And the speaker from Germany was the major speaker representing the West at the plenary sessions. There were many speakers from the West at the 30 separate workshop sessions. And his view was the most interesting to me, and I challenged it from the floor, is, well, we have to accept multipolarity. But in this multipolar world, there still has to be a rules-based order. And that was his argument, which I don't know if everybody picked up on, but I did, and I brought it up a couple of times when I was called upon to speak, because there has to be order in this multipolarity. We can't just let anything happen. And this represents the extreme Western chauvinism and arrogance, and still overtones of imperialism and colonialism. And you'll see, if you read the coverage, we'll go back and forth between the topics here. If you read the coverage of the BRICS conference, and I get this from my friends all the time, the BRICS conference is examined over whether it will be anti-Western and whether the West will support it, and whether these countries should be engaged in this. Now, publicly, Secretary of State Blinken will say, well, of course, every sovereign country has the right to make a sovereign decision about what alliance they don't. But behind that is they see, again, as an adversarial relationship, because much of the BRICS is positioned around China. I mean, China plays an oversized role because it's an oversized country in the BRICS and in the global South or South-South. So they're now, and they will tell you that's the best that they'll say. The other media will say, or has said already, that really nothing happened at the BRICS. This was just an attempt by President Putin to draw his allies around him and put the best possible face onto the war that he's waged on Ukraine that is destroying his own economy. So nothing was done. Now, even though there are 9 official BRIC members, there were 5, and then several were added, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and UAE. I think Saudi Arabia is somewhere in the middle. And then there were 13 partners, friends of the BRICS, which included Nigeria, largest country in Africa, Pakistan. So if you take the total, you're talking about 22 countries, friends and members. Well, that's almost 60% of the world's population. It's a huge portion. I mean, in Africa alone, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and Ethiopia, if Nigeria were to join, that already represents over 500 million Africans, almost over 1/3 of the continent. So the BRICS is a real political force. And much of the discussion went on the BRICS. If you looked at their 135-point position paper, I think it's number 62, is the development bank. They, unlike NATO, which is a military alliance, the BRICS is not a military alliance. The BRICS is an economic alliance of countries who want the paradigm to be economic development, not war, not control, not the rules-based order. So the United States is trying to dismiss this, as they usually do. They dismiss the FOCAC meeting. Oh, nothing much got accomplished there. And they'll say, nothing really got accomplished at the BRICS, except Russia was able to show it has friends and allies. This is typical. And the problem is it's a mindset that they refuse to look at why these countries are forming alliances and why they're making progress in economic development. And this brings me back to the Xiangshan conference, because as I mentioned to you, the third issue was security and development. China sees these as completely connected. The United States does not. The United States sees security as military kinetic defense capabilities, which have not been working out too well anywhere, much less Africa. But China says, no, security development provides us with security. And the 5 African speakers, but also there was a very good speaker from one of the Asian countries, which I'm forgetting at the moment, Singapore, they spoke on the question of the need for development. Now, they were all defense ministers, but they spoke on the need for development, as did the Chinese national defense minister. And they talked about the need for a policy of building up the economies of Asia and Africa. So this is very similar to what the BRICS discuss. The new development bank of the BRICS is small, but it is part of a change in world dynamics, because even though it's a small bank relative to what we see from the Western side, but on the other hand, its orientation is completely different. And they see the primary responsibility of the BRICS is the development bank, because the development bank will continue to support economic progress and growth in the other nations, of which 3 of the official 9 are African nations. But obviously, Iran, Russia, I mean, these are very large countries, Saudi Arabia, if they join, Brazil, of course. So the BRICS conception of a commitment to development was brought up and obvious at the conference I attended in Beijing. And it was brought up by the defense ministers. Now, if you look at China, and I don't have a full history of China, but you could see the problem that the West has at this moment, because were they to recognize what China's accomplished, they would have to dismantle the ideology of the rules-based order and the zero-sum game, because China breaks the mold, which they can't really deal with, and they've never answered these questions. But if you look at what China has accomplished, it's phenomenal. First of all, I mean, China, what the Chinese call they call the New China, was the founding of the New China by Mao Zedong in 1949. And they were a backward, poor, peasant country. And they went through some very rough times. But they started out, their probably life expectancy was similar to Africa in the 30s, 35, 36 years old, something like that. And then they went through some very difficult times. And I think many people probably read about the leap forward. And then you probably are somewhat familiar with the Cultural Revolution, which was a reactionary backward movement that really hurt China quite a bit and undermined its own people and its own economy. That ends in 1976 about. And in 1978, I would say you have the next phase of China, which is Deng Xiaoping's coming out of China, opening up of China, where one is that the Chinese sent out people to explore the rest of the world, learn from the rest of the world, and at the same time invited the rest of the world in. And this had a profound effect and began the process of China removing itself from the economic stranglehold of its peasantry and becoming an industrialized modern economy. That begins in 1978. The next phase, of course, is when Xi Jinping becomes the premier in 2012, and he launches a year later the Belt and Road Initiative, and also then defines China as a socialist country with Chinese characteristics. Because capitalism is there, it's all over China. Kentucky Fried Chicken, Dairy Queen, and McDonald's are all over the place in China. I don't go to those places here, so I didn't go there, although people tell me the food is completely different. That's a whole nother question, Chinese food, but we won't get to that. So capitalism is everywhere, and I was questioning this tour guide I had, because we did a whole tour of Tiananmen Square, which is the largest square inside an urban center in the world. It's gigantic, very impressive. They check your passport 4 times before you get in. But they do have the defense ministry there, so there is military significance. But you could see from Tiananmen Square, you could see this McDonald's. And I said to my tour guide, Chinese woman, I said, well, why do you guys allow that? It destroys the majestic beauty of Tiananmen Square. And I've seen this also in Egypt, where they have Kentucky Fried Chicken next to this pyramid. I said, well, you guys shouldn't allow that. And my tour guide said, well, that's capitalism. They're allowed to invest. I said, well, can't you have some top-down communist control so you can keep them out of certain areas? And she said, no, that's not our policy anymore. So the idea that capitalism doesn't exist in China, is a joke. And as you'll see if you stick around to watch my slides, this place is just filled with high skyrise buildings, skyscrapers. And I grew up in New York and I spent a lot of time in Manhattan. And Manhattan is small compared to what they have as buildings because they don't really have that many homes, except in the very old parts of the cities in Beijing. So your home is your apartment, is your home. You buy it. I don't know if it's a condom. I don't think so. Condominium. You own your residence. It could be on the 14th floor of a 24-floor skyscraper, but that's what you own as your home to raise your family. So they have accomplished an enormous amount. I was talking to my tour guide. She's about 40 years old, married. She's a professional. Husband's a professional. They have a 12-year-old daughter. So she's 40. Her parents, so that's one generation, 20, 25 years ago, they were riding bicycles before she was born. And now Beijing is packed with cars. The traffic is as bad as the Beltway in DC or driving Manhattan. And they're doing a lot to try to push electric vehicles. And they actually have a procedure where, based on your license plate number, you're not allowed to enter Beijing for that day or that week. And you have to either take a taxi or you have to take the train system, which is quite well developed. And all the taxis are electric vehicles. Tesla has 3 plants there themselves, so much for decoupling, but there's also a lot of private Chinese companies that are producing EVs. I didn't sense any pollution myself when I was there. I think they've solved the problem. Plus, they really changed urban planning. They have these beautiful parks, gardens, palaces everywhere, but parks everywhere. Right across from my hotel, which was a prestigious hotel, I wanted to get out for a while and go across the street. And there's a beautiful park. The rocks are arranged. The garden is there. Parents are playing with their children. They come up to me to talk because I'm an American. So the whole different way of life over there. But if you look at what the Chinese have done, let's say 49 to 38, and then 49 to 1978, and 1978 to 2024, they've lifted 750 million people out of poverty. And as President Biden would say, and that's no joke. And they've done it, and it's been verified by the Western institutions. So if Africa were to eliminate poverty, which it could do, I know how to do it. I mean, I know what the policy should be, but it could be done. So China has already a model. Now, you may not want to follow the model, but again, it's not discovering the cure for cancer. It's been done. African countries can look to China and say, you eliminated poverty. And therefore, that actually becomes a basis of optimism and hope. Because if it's been done one place in the world by human beings, why can't it be done in other places of the world by human beings? There's no such optimism when you look at what the United States has done or not done. One of the I had two additional great pleasures there, which reinforced again my conception of economic development in China, which is when I was in Beijing to go south to Shanghai, because I figured I don't know when I'm going to get to this part of the world again, and everybody said you got to see Shanghai. I could have flown, but I didn't want to. I wanted to take the high-speed rail. Now, this is not the magnetic levitation. This is high-speed rail. And again, I have pictures of it if you stick around, but we went from China to Shanghai, Pudong, they're right next to each other, which is 819 miles. Anybody want to take a guess how long it took us? Okay.
I wouldn't be guessing, I already know.
Okay. So it took 4 hours and 35 minutes to go 819 miles. And we passed through a number of cities. I have pictures of this. When I came back, I said, well, how far is it from Washington, D.C. to Chicago? That's only 600 miles. Anybody want to take a guess how long that takes on Amtrak? 17 hours. Now, if you had a high-speed rail, you would be going by rail to Chicago, by rail to Atlanta. You'd probably go by rail to California. And you would cut down pollution, which we seem to be obsessed with, or the green technology. You cut out going in and out of airports, which takes 3 hours on each side of just getting through security. There's nothing like it in the United States. The Excella, which runs on the East Coast, I took it once because it was paid for me by somebody else. It's like $230. The Excella averages a speed of only 75 to 100 miles. Its maximum speed, which is why it's called high speed, is because it is 150 miles of this. Let me put it this way: there's 48 miles of track on the East Coast alone that can handle the Accelerator at 150 miles an hour. 48 miles of track, and there's over 200,000 miles of track in the United States. So you do the math on your calculator. It's infinitesimal. China has about 30,000 kilometers of track of high speed out of approximately, I guess, 150, 160,000 kilometers of track. And the statistics are in my article. So who's kidding whom about who's an advanced country? The infrastructure in the United States is archaic. It literally parts of it are from another century. I think I travel over the Brooklyn Bridge when I'm in New York to visit my relatives in Brooklyn. That was built in 1900s. And parts of the train systems in the United States were built in the 1900s. So this is a breakthrough that can be utilized. I don't know if Nicky actually took the train if he went to China and took the train, but there's a video I showed my wife on the internet, which shows a guy standing up a quarter on its side, and the quarter doesn't fall either way. It is so smooth. And then they serve you lunch if it's not much. Now, the other part is, how much did it cost to go from Beijing to Shanghai? $95. It cost $120 to go from Baltimore to New York on a train that takes 3.5 hours. And just for those of us who are technologically inspired, just to whet your appetite, I also, when I was in Shanghai, it's about 28 miles from the city of Shanghai to Pudong, where the airport is and the railroad station is. So my tour, this was the end of my last day. They said, well, we'll drive you there. I said, no. You drop me off at the train station. I'm taking the magnetic levitated train from Shanghai to Pudong. I wasn't going to pass this one up. So sure enough, $6. And it went 28 miles in 6 minutes. And I'll show you pictures, no wheels. People line up for the train to fully stop it to let you on. And that took longer than the train ride, because the train ride was only 6 minutes. Now, there have been plans to build a magnetic levitated train from Baltimore to DC, from Los Angeles to San Francisco, from Orlando to Disney World. Never been done. Now, they didn't reach full maximum speed. The maximum speed on the magnetic train is 345 miles. We only got up to about 200 kilometers per hour, which is about 180 miles an hour, because the trip was so short. You didn't pay to get up to that speed. So it was slightly less speed than the high-speed rail, but it was a much shorter difference. So when you see these kind of accomplishments of China under, periods now, China's 75 years old, and you look where it was, and if you're lucky enough to talk to people who were there in the 70s, you see everybody rode a bicycle in those days. There were no cars. And you look where it is today. I was downtown Beijing. I took a picture outside the tallest building in Beijing, and all the people who worked there, the young men and women, they all looked like the young men and women in the United States. Very fancy clothes, pants fit just right, the jackets fit just right. They got their cell phones in their hand, and they're professionals. And many of them, they take the train into a portion of Beijing, and then they take bikes from the station to where they work in these tall buildings. So everywhere in Beijing and Shanghai, you see two things all the time: huge buildings that are taller than anything in the US, and more of them, and bicycles. Rented bicycles everywhere. I mean, they fill blocks, they're lined up. And these people are productive people. There's a large capitalist class. There's a lot of young people who want upward mobility, and they're going to continue. So the question is, what kind of a disservice is the United States and the rules-based order performing, but that not wanting to recognize this accomplishment and not wanting to be part of it? China is not trying to conquer the United States. Now, because we're in this silly season of campaigning, I torture myself by listening to a lot of debates and local candidates. The NPR station, National Public Radio, C-SPAN, plays candidate debates from all over the United States. And every Democrat and every congressman debate I've heard, and all Democrats and all the congressmen and the two leaders of the two parties, is you ask them who the number one enemy of the United States is, they will not say Russia, even though we're in a proxy war with Russia. I mean, more than proxy, I believe NATO is in Ukraine right now and in Russia, obviously. They will say China. China is the number one enemy of the United States. I don't know if you knew that. I don't know if you know why it is. But because the thinking of the think tanks, which is really unthinking, you should come up with a new word, unthinking. The unthinking of the think tanks, is China's going to try to conquer the world in the next 100 years. Or not conquer the world, but conquer the United States and become the number one country in the world in 100 years. And we have to work on it now to stop it. And that China is the reason given by Secretary Lloyd Austin for why we have a $1 trillion defense budget. Now, Nick and I have both been to Africa. Think about what you could do with $1 trillion to build housing, to build hospitals, to build schools, to build health clinics. But $1 trillion goes into a budget. And of course, if you talk to the government, they'll say, well, that's good, creating jobs. Yeah, jobs in the military industrial defense, jobs are being created by this $1 trillion. But if you talk to the Chinese people, their concerns are very clear. One is they have, and they go through rough times just like we do. They're going through a little bit of rough time right now, but they have jobs, they have homes, they have families. And why do they support the military buildup by China? And the military buildup in percentages is significant. In absolute terms, it doesn't come close to the United States, about a third. But they said that's good because we want our country to be so strong that it won't be invaded. And of course, China from 1840s all the way up to the 1900s was invaded. Invaded by Japan, invaded by the British, invaded by the Westerners, 2 opium wars. The list is long and I'm going through. So they say it's a good thing that President Xi is building up a strong military that protects us. We don't want to be subjected to anybody anymore. And those are the two things they look at: economy and sovereignty and defense of the nation. They have not invaded anyone. I don't know if you noticed that. I mean, and just in the last 20 years, and not just if we go back 70, I mean, we invaded Afghanistan. We overthrew Saddam Hussein, destroyed Iraq, even though he was a secular leader who held the country together. We invaded Syria. We invaded Libya and killed Gaddafi. We now are more or less involved directly on Russian soil in this war. Of course, that doesn't even mention the Vietnam War.
Panama,
or the first invasion into Afghanistan in the 1980s. China doesn't invade anyone. Nick may know the answer to this. Do you know how many military bases China has around the world? Anybody want to take a guess?
It's like 400 and something, 440, right?
There's
Oh,
one.
sorry. You're talking about Chinese or American?
Oh, yeah.
China.
Yeah, China has one.
One in Djibouti, yeah.
Correct. That's their only military base in the world. And it's in Djibouti. Now it's in Djibouti for obvious reasons. There are 5, 6 other countries that have military bases in Djibouti. Just look at the geography, you'll see why. France, the US, Japan, Germany, there's 5 other countries. But they have one. And as Nick just pointed out, we have over 400. They're not a militaristic country. Now, there's a lot of fuss that gets kicked up around Taiwan. That is a very unique issue. It's been agreed to by 3 international treaties. So there is no reason to bring up the issue because it's already been codified in 3 treaties, which the United States is part of. But again, the unthink tanks in Washington say no. And a lot of people say China is going to take over Taiwan in the next 5 years, next 10 years, next 20 years. So this is another issue of why the United States is making a mistake. It's an error. It's a strategic error that is dangerous. Aside from being stupid, it's dangerous to have this adversary relationship with China. And again, I had people, I would just walk up to me, of course, people want to take a picture with me, but people would say, one a young man was playing catch with his child, and he said, "You from America? Where are you from?" I said, "America." He said, "Do you think it's possible after this election that China and the U.S. could become friends?" I said, "We should." I said, "We don't know what's going to happen in this election." But it was a very innocent question. There's no dislike of the United States. No one walks around calling the United States the number 1 enemy the way our congressmen and our presidents do. Their concern is modernization, and they've modernized their economy massively over 35 years. Now, I'm getting some interaction here between the audience. What do you think the average life expectancy in the United States is? Male and female, just divided by the number of people. How long do you think people expected to live in the United States?
75 years?
Close, 78. And how long do you think people now are expected to live in China? 78.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah. So, and they started out in 70 years ago at 35, 36. And they didn't grow that much even up to Deng Xiaoping in 1978. The takeoff was after 78. In 35 years, they've more or less doubled the life expectancy. How did they do that? By having a dictatorship? By the evils of communism? Now, I'm not a Chinese citizen, nor am I a communist, although I've been called a communist more times than a number of people on this seminar. But you have a different system, and they call it socialism with Chinese characteristics, because they have to, because capitalism is all over China. We have a different system. I'm not sure what our system, it should be called democracy, though I think that's really maligning the word democracy. But we have a capitalist system, I guess. But I would call it a finance capitalist system, not an industrial capitalist system. They have modernized their economy. And if you look at their plans, including the last one they just issued, they want to continue modernization. That's their goal. Automation, new technology, and modernization, with the goal to be a modernized socialist economy in 11 years. And they also have made very clear at the FOCAC conference, they want to modernize Africa. Oh my God, that's really terrible. That's a communist plot to modernize Africa. Now, Africa, I'm an expert on the subject. I mean, they need trillions of dollars of infrastructure, not billions, trillions. If you look at the energy needs, my rough estimate is 1,600 gigawatts of power needed to allow Africans to live like we do. Right now, the people on this Zoom call, they need minimum 100,000 kilometers of rail, high-speed rail. A high-speed rail in Africa, I took the train from Abuja to Kaduna in Nigeria several years ago. It was 50 miles an hour. It was a pleasant drive. I was ecstatic. It's the first train I've ever been on in my life in Africa, even though I've been going there for 30 years. But it went 50 miles an hour. So that's not exactly high speed. But it is high speed when the old colonial trains went 25 miles an hour. So you look at this, you look at what their goals are. their goals are the same goals we have. Develop your economy, make your people satisfied, provide productive jobs, provide security. And that then touches on the real responsibility of government, which is to develop the creative powers of each person. But you can't do that unless you have the physical components. So let me conclude my initial presentation with the fact that the culture in China and Shanghai is so exquisite, and it just changes the way you think about this area of the world. Because in Beijing, and I'll show you some pictures, like Shanghai, you walk to or take the train to palaces and gardens that have lakes and walkways, all decorated. Some of them come from the 1600s, the old dynasty. Some of them come from the more modern Jing dynasty. But you're walking in history with finely delicate statues in jade and fine palaces. And then the Summer Palace, the Forbidden City, the Lama temples, the Jade Lama, all these things are right there for the people. You walk to them, and it was so exciting for me to see. This was a Monday, the first day in the rain, and thousands, tens of thousands of people, old people with canes, older than me. I mean, they were old, and they're walking with canes through these palaces and these gardens. Young people, people in their 30s, what we'd call, people with children. And the Summer Palace, unfortunately, I messed up pictures on my camera, but I suggest you look it up at the end on your own in your internet. Summer Palace was the most gorgeous place I've ever been. I mean, a beautiful lake, beautifully decorated parts of the palace. You get in a boat, you just can go out there. And I could see myself on a Sunday just going there, sitting on a rock, reading a book. And there was this old guy with a bucket of water from the lake and a mop, but it wasn't really a mop. It was a mop that was kind of pointed at the end, so it'd be like a pen. And he was just writing Chinese characteristics on the sidewalk in water. Of course, they would dry up. And so someone came from Poland, so he'd write, citizens from Poland are welcome. I mean, the Summer Palace just will never leave my mind. But it was only one of many places I saw. And these are all accessible in the city. So when you get into Beijing and Shanghai, you have this wonderful contrast of very clear modernity. I'm talking 35 years. High-rise buildings, big highways. And then you have 16th century, 1800s, 1900s culture, and it's side by side. And it had, I must say, it had a profound effect on me. This is a country that you'd want to learn about, not make your enemy. I think about Baltimore. I don't know how it is where you guys are, but in Baltimore, the big spectacle downtown is a stadium for the football team and a stadium for the baseball team. And I'm saying to myself, now in the United States, you can't walk to a place that's several hundred years old. It's very hard to find. I mean, you can go to Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, you can go to Gettysburg, but they're not several hundred years old. They're 100 to 200 years old. And they're not beautiful. They're battlefields. But imagine if you had a city where the citizens could take a train and spend their afternoons and mornings seeing beautiful history right next to modernity. So therefore, I will end by suggesting whatever means you have, and if you ever get an invitation and you ever have somehow hit it big on the lottery, go to Beijing. I mean, it's a whole different culture, much less the Great Wall of China, which I went to. That was the first thing I went to Monday morning. And I couldn't make it all the way to the top. I went 1,000 steps, but I was still 3 levels from the top. And that the whole mountain range, there's just so much beauty and so much culture and so much history that if we appreciated it with the modern part of economic development, as I mentioned, I think I titled one of my papers, we could make China would be a great partner for development, a great partner for transforming the world, a great partner for ending poverty in Africa and other parts of Southeast Asia. And this trip for me was inspiring, as my trip to Italy and Greece, learning about Western culture, was inspiring. And this should be the outlook that all of us have. And we've got to defeat the mentality of this insane, idiotic, dangerous, perverted, rules-based order, zero-sum game. We don't have to become China. We're not going to. And China's not going to become the United States, I can guarantee you that. Why is that necessary? Why can't different systems operate together for the benefit of mankind? So that's the effect of the conference and my crammed-in touring over the days. It was a really spectacular event for me, and hope I've been able to impart some of that to you.